Older generations of Reddit, who were the "I don't use computers" people of your time? My grandpa used to tell me that he was basically set for life because he learned to read and write. Mass illiteracy wasn't as long ago as we like to think. Even being able to type 30 years ago was a huge advantage. Yay. My grandmother was obsessed with us learning typing. I never did, but now I swipe with one finger faster than she can type. I teach in a middle school, and students' keyboard skills have noticeably declined over the last 10 years as their go-to tech devices have transitioned to mostly touch screens. Yes. I'm 47. And I distinctly remember being a young teenager and feeling pressure to speed up my typing. Being able to type 70 WPM was a huge plus to put on your resume. It meant you could get hired for data entry jobs and word processing jobs, both of which were in big demand back then, particularly in the temp field, which was a great way to get job experience as a teenager. Digital clocks are lazy. As silly as this is, I think that analog clocks will always be around. As a nearsighted person, I can often read an analog when my eyes can't see a digital one. I love analog. It pleases my brain to see time as portions of a circle. My alarm clock's face is LCD, but can show analog time. It's nice. My school has to hold an assembly for the 5th graders every year, who can't read analog clocks cause they can't afford to replace all the clocks in the middle high school building. My grandfather refused to get a VCR. But not because he was a Luddite. VCRs were all made in Japan, and he had fought in the Pacific in World War II, so he refused to buy anything Japanese. Interesting side fact, this is why Nissan originally started selling cars as Datsun. They figured there was gonna be a lot of bitter vets who remember Nissan making war materials. No car of mine will have electric windows. You're asking for trouble, Uncle Fred. In his defense, the early electric windows were pretty unreliable. So that one was pretty justified initially. I mean, that was like 20-30 years ago, but still. Power windows first came out in 1940 in high-end cars. They didn't migrate past the luxury divisions until the early 70s, and even then manuals were still dominant into the 90s. My grandparents were the first people to have a television in their neck of the woods, rural NC in the 1950s. A big deal back then. Grandma told a story how when riding on a bus back from work one day, and a couple of her neighbors were on there too. They were talking about how the Blakeburners got one of them fancy TVs, saying how it was an evil thing, and would simply bad of them to buy one, and that they, the neighbors, were wise enough never to get one. Of course, they knew my grandmother was on the bus with them, as they said it really loud so she would hear them. Petty jealousy from them made my grandma run off the bus in tears. Story goes that grandpa, a mechanic who was doing well enough they could buy a TV, was so livid that he refused to work on these neighbors' vehicles for decades. He was the only mechanic around for almost 20 miles, which then was an hour drive from anywhere else. Justice served. Color TV. When they became common in the mid-60s, a lot of older people believed they emitted harmful rays. When mom finally got one circa 1972, it was kept in her bedroom, and we were ushered in to watch it only on special occasions. And we had to sit at least 10 feet away. When I was little, my mother would have us evacuate the kitchen whenever she used the microwave. LMAO, your use of the word evacuate makes me imagine your mother doing drills with you and your family on proper evacuation procedure. Sadly, you are not far off. My grandmother didn't like to use the remote control for her television because she was afraid it would break somehow and function as a laser, dangerous enough to set things on fire. My grandmother complained about remote controls for TVs because it would promote people being lazy. Because apparently watching TV in the first place is a rigorous activity. My grandmother is 97 and told me about people who would refuse to get air conditioning or drink sodas because they the devil's work. She grew up on a farm in a 2-room house with 11 family members living in that house. She always had sodas and the AC rocking and rolling all summer. That's as hilarious as it is terrifying. 9 of the people, kids, had to share one room, the other was for her parents. Back in the 80s, I knew an old lady who used one of those really old toasters that could only toast one side of the bread at a time. As a present, We went out and bought her a modern pop-up toaster, but she wouldn't use it. She preferred to use her old one. I could see if she had one of those rad Sunbeam Radiant toasters, which in many ways are superior to any toaster on the market today, but this is just a fire waiting to happen. I see you also have watched that Technology Connections video. My grandaunt still believes that 15 is the age of adulthood, that schooling isn't necessary beyond that point. She grew up in a time when literacy wasn't a given, with a bachelor's degree, and my very mediocre Spanish I would have killed it in 1920. For all of about 8 years. Well, now I'm greatly depressed. My grandmother is 89. When she was a kid, she had an uncle who hated cars. He called them machines, and refused to drive one. It could have been job security though, her whole family worked for the railroad. In all fairness, cars are machines. Then again, so are trains. Fun fact. The Russian word for car is machina. My senior year of high school, I had a series of newspaper articles in the local paper explaining how the web wasn't a fad and wasn't going away. Nobody but one guy at the paper believed it. It was 1995. My high school, I graduated in 2000, was like this. We didn't have computers in school, and although there was pressure to buy them, the administration claimed computers were a dying fad, and spent the money that was to go for a computer lab on new football equipment instead. Spoiler alert, they were going to spend the money on football equipment no matter what, and that was the best excuse they could come up with. I am the web designer for a local organization. Their treasurer refuses to accept card payment via their website. People have to print out forms, fill them out, and post them with a check. I also get paid by check with a handwritten note. They would be a much more popular and successful business if they just modernized a little. My law firm still uses checks. We're also on QuickBooks Desktop 2008, and our timekeeping software is from 2011. We don't use Word, we use WordPerfect, and our forms are still set up to double space after periods. Nightmarish. Anyone under age 60 shouldn't be able to use the computer excuse. Computers have been common in the workplace for nearly 30 years now. Shit, I have a friend in her 20s right now that uses the computer excuse. I'm just not a computer person. She was applying for a job, they emailed her some paperwork, and said, sign it and send it back, and she didn't know what to do. She came over my house, and I didn't feel like going through the headache of teaching digital signing applications, so we printed it, signed it, and scanned it, and sent it in. I took a computer class as a sophomore college, about 11 years ago, and the professor asked, who here has never used a word processor, and some hands went up. You then saw the professor had the same thought I did, oh, maybe they're not familiar with the term, and said you know, like Microsoft Word or OpenOffice. Hands still stayed up. This still boggles my mind. Even if you were extremely poor, from an extremely poor hometown, and never had access to a computer, and were going to college on scholarship, the college had many computer labs. How the hell did you make it through freshman year without having to type a single paper? Touch tone dialing. My mom refused to pay the $1 and change a month to have it. She finally caved in around 2002. Edit, since several have asked, touch tone was a keypad, much like what almost every phone is now. Before that it was a rotary dial phone. When my dad was in his 80s and losing some of his marbles, I started taking over some of his household chores and errands. Discovered that he was still using a rotary phone because he wasn't paying for touch tone. He was, however, still paying a rental fee for his telephone. He'd been renting it for 50 years. We went to the phone store and got him a touch tone, and they waived the fee so that his bill pretty much remained the same with the new phone. I also got him a cordless, but he hated using it. He'd forget how to answer it, press talk, poke. It was sad to watch a formerly bright person, former high school teacher, totally unable to cope with simple household items. I still miss him. When I was first out of undergrad, 96, I went to work on Wall Street. I was assigned a desk that happened to include the oldest person in the office. His first day on the job was the fucking 1929 crash. He hated the computers, of course, but what really got him was the fact that every damn desk needed a telephone. He'd use them, but he grumbled about it. He would complain pretty frequently and loudly about the fact that he couldn't smoke cigars and drink whiskey at his desk. To be fair, he also grumbled about the fact that women worked right there with the real brokers. He also told dirty jokes. The only one I remember is young Mr. Smokalaw. Do you talk to your wife after 6? Only if you're near a phone. Then he'd ask me if I understood the joke. Every time he told it. R.I.P. Andy. You were one of a kind.